It was a quiet, foggy night when Claire left the party. The streets were eerily empty and the streetlights flickered as though they might give out at any moment. The air was thick with an uneasy stillness, the kind that made her fingers itch to turn up the car radio just to drown it out. She wasn't supposed to be driving this late. Her parents had warned her against taking shortcuts through the back roads, especially at night. But the party had gone long, and Claire was desperate to get home before they noticed she was late. The shortcut seemed harmless at first, just a stretch of road winding through the woods. The fog hugged the trees like a ghostly shroud, and her high beams barely pierced the mist. As she approached a red light at an empty intersection, her mind wandered to Mia, her best friend, who had stayed behind at the party. Was Mia mad at her for leaving early? She hadn't seemed upset, but something about the goodbye had felt off. Claire checked her rearview mirror out of habit, and that's when she froze. There was a man sitting in her back seat. He hadn't been there when she got into the car. She was sure of it. Her chest tightened as her mind scrambled for an explanation. He wore a tattered coat, and his face was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to glint unnaturally in the dim light. Claire's breath hitched as she gripped the steering wheel tighter, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Don't scream," the man said, his voice low and cold. "Let's play a game." Her mouth went dry, and her stomach churned. "Who are you? What do you want?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The man's lips curved into a thin, sinister smile. "Truth or consequence?" he said, ignoring her questions. "A simple game. I'll ask you a question. If you tell the truth, you'll live. Lie or refuse to answer, and you'll face the consequence." "What kind of consequence?" Claire asked, her voice barely audible. He leaned forward, and she could feel his icy breath against the back of her neck. "You'll find out," he said. "Now drive." The light turned green, but Claire hesitated, her foot hovering over the brake. "Drive," the man repeated, his tone sharper. Her shaking foot pressed the gas pedal, and the car rolled forward into the fog. The first question came quickly, his voice cutting through the thick silence. "Why did you leave your best friend alone at the party tonight?" Claire's heart sank. I didn't. She said she wanted to stay longer." The man's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Lying already? Tsk, tisk. Time for a consequence." Before Claire could respond, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her hands trembling. It was a text from Mia. "Where did you go?" "I told you I wasn't feeling safe." The message cut off, replaced by static, as the phone screen flickered and died. Claire's blood ran cold. "Don't worry," the man said, his voice dripping with mockery. "We're just getting started." As they drove deeper into the foggy back roads, the questions became more personal, each one peeling back layers of Claire's guilt and regrets. Why did she betray Mia during last summer's trip? Why did she lie to her parents about where she was tonight? Each answer felt like a dagger to her chest, and the man's dark laughter echoed through the car, filling the space like a tangible weight. But when she faltered, the consequences grew more horrifying. At one point, the headlights flickered, and the road ahead warped into a swirling void of shadows. Figures appeared in the fog, distorted, wailing faces of people she recognized. Mia, her parents, even strangers she had wronged in passing. They clawed at the windows, their screams muffled but haunting, their eyes filled with accusation. "The road knows your sins, Claire," the man said, his tone matter-of-fact. "And it's hungry." Desperate, Claire tried to pull over, but the brakes wouldn't respond. The car sped up on its own, the engine roaring like a beast possessed. The man leaned back, his expression one of cold amusement, as if he was savoring her fear. "Final question," he said, his voice cutting through her rising panic like a knife. "Do you deserve to live?" Tears streamed down Claire's face as she struggled to find an answer. I don't know," she screamed. "I'm sorry for everything. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. Please, Let me go." The man tilted his head, considering her answer. His hollow eyes seemed to pierce through her soul. "A coward's answer," he said finally. "Let's see what the road thinks." The car veered sharply, the fog swallowing everything. The wailing grew louder, and Claire felt the icy grip of unseen hands pulling at her from every direction. Her screams were swallowed by the darkness as the car plunged into an endless abyss. When she woke, the car was parked neatly outside her house. The back seat was empty, and the street was silent. Shaking, she stumbled inside, locking every door and window behind her. But as she collapsed onto her bed, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from an unknown number. "See you next time." The game never ends. The next morning, the news reported a tragic accident on the back road Claire had taken. A car had swerved off the road, its driver found dead inside, but Claire knew the truth. The game had spared her, this time. Jake had been on the road for hours, his GPS losing signal somewhere between the flat plains and dense forests. He was heading cross-country, eager to reach his new job on the other side of the state. When his fuel gauge dipped into the red, he began scanning the road for signs of civilization. That's when he saw it. A weathered wooden sign at the side of the road. "Welcome to Gray Hollow." The town wasn't on his map, but it was better than running out of gas in the middle of nowhere. Jake turned down the narrow road leading into Gray Hollow. At first glance, the town seemed quaint, with rows of old-fashioned buildings lining the main street. But as he drove deeper, unease crept in. The streets were completely deserted. No cars, no pedestrians, no sign of life at all. He parked in front of what looked like a diner. Its neon sign flickered weakly. Open 24/7. Yet through the window, the interior was dark. Jake stepped out of his car, the silence pressing down on him like a weight. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing. No response. The air felt stale, and the faint scent of mildew lingered. Jake tried the door to the diner. It creaked open easily. Inside, the tables were set with plates and silverware, as though the diners had just stepped away. But the food on the plates was rotting, swarming with flies. Something wasn't right. Jake backed out and hurried to the gas station across the street, only to find the pumps rusted and the inside of the shop covered in a thick layer of dust. As he walked down the street, his unease deepened. Storefronts displayed mannequins frozen in bizarre, unsettling poses. One mannequin's head was tilted at an unnatural angle, its blank face seeming to follow Jake as he passed. He tried his phone again. No signal. Even the sky above seemed off, the clouds hanging unnaturally low, casting a grayish hue over everything. Desperation set in. Jake decided to leave, but when he returned to his car, it wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died, leaving him stranded. "Stay calm," he muttered, gripping the steering wheel. Movement caught his eye. A figure standing at the end of the street. It was too far away to make out details, but it was definitely human. Relief washed over him as he stepped out of the car. "Hey, can you help me?" Jake called, jogging toward the figure. But as he got closer, his relief turned to dread. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. When Jake finally reached it, he realized it wasn't a person at all. It was another mannequin, dressed in tattered clothes, its head twisted toward the sky. A low, guttural sound echoed through the street. Jake spun around, but the town was still empty. The sound came again, closer this time, a growl that raised the hairs on the back of his neck. He ran back to his car, slamming the door shut and locking it. The growling grew louder, accompanied by the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy. Jake dared to look in the rearview mirror. A shadowy figure stood behind the car, its form indistinct but undeniably menacing. Its glowing eyes burned into Jake's, and as it raised an elongated clawed hand, the car began to shake violently. Panicked, Jake scrambled out and ran, not caring where he went as long as it was away. The growling followed him, along with faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls of the buildings themselves. Every street he turned down looked the same. The town twisted and shifted, trapping him in an endless loop. At one point, he found himself back at the diner, the door now ajar and light spilling out. Desperate, Jake stepped inside. Inside, the diner was alive with movement. Figures sat at the tables, eating and laughing, their faces eerily blank. They all turned to look at him, their mouths opening impossibly wide in silent screams. Jake ran to the back of the diner, finding a door that led into a pitch-black corridor. He could hear the whispers growing louder, beckoning him forward. When he stepped through, he wasn't in the diner anymore. He was back on the street, but this time the town was alive. People bustled about, the sun shining brightly overhead. Jake blinked in disbelief. Had he imagined everything? But as he walked toward his car, he noticed something chilling. Every person he passed had no eyes, just empty, hollow sockets. They turned to face him, smiling wide as they whispered in unison, "Welcome to Grey Hollow." It had been a long drive. The heavy snowstorm that had followed them for miles had only worsened as the night deepened. Tired and desperate for shelter, Ethan and Claire spotted a small village nestled in the valley ahead, its lights flickering in the storm like a beacon of warmth. They decided to pull over, hoping to find a place to stay until the storm passed. The village was quaint, its cobblestone streets blanketed in snow. They found an inn at the heart of the village and checked in, hoping to rest before continuing their journey. The innkeeper, an older man with a weathered face, gave them a strange look as he handed over the room keys. He muttered something about the storm being worse than usual, but when they asked if the village was prepared for it, he only nodded solemnly. "Stay inside tonight," he warned, "and don't wander outside after the storm breaks. You never know when the crimson snow might fall." Ethan and Claire exchanged a confused glance but brushed it off as local superstition. They made their way to their room and the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. That night, they were awoken by a strange sound, like soft tapping against the window. It was still snowing heavily, but when they looked outside, something was off. The snow had turned red. At first, it appeared to be a trick of the light, the glow from the inn's lanterns reflecting off the fresh snow. But as they stared, they realized that the entire snowfall was crimson, as if the very sky was bleeding. Claire shuddered. "It's just the light, right? It can't be real." Ethan shook his head, unsettled. "I don't know. Something doesn't feel right." They tried to dismiss the unsettling sight, but when they stepped outside to get a closer look, the red snow was unmistakable. It was as if the world had been drenched in blood. The villagers were gathered in the square, their faces drawn and pale, murmuring in hushed tones. The innkeeper, now standing in the middle of the group, turned to them with a grave expression. "The creature is coming," he said quietly. "The crimson snow signals its return." Ethan and Claire's confusion turned to dread as the villagers explained. Every few decades, the village was visited by a monstrous creature, a being born of the earth and sky. It was said to emerge from the mountains during a blood-red snowstorm, its hunger insatiable, its fury unrelenting. And when the snow turned crimson, it would demand a sacrifice. The villagers, resigned to their fate, prepared for the worst. Some spoke of running, but the creature was swift, always finding its prey. The only hope was that a sacrifice would appease it, one chosen by fate. "The sacrifice must come from the outside," the innkeeper said, his voice trembling. "It must be someone who doesn't belong here." Ethan's stomach turned as he realized the implication. "You mean one of us?" The innkeeper nodded gravely. "It's the way of things. We have no choice." Panic set in. Ethan and Claire looked around, realizing they were trapped. The storm had become worse, and they could see no way to leave the village. The roads were impassable, and there was no other place to go. As the night wore on, The crimson snow began to fall harder, blanketing everything in its horrific hue. The air grew colder, and the sound of distant growls echoed through the village, growing closer with each passing minute. The villagers hurried into their homes, locking doors and windows, leaving only a few standing in the square, each waiting for the inevitable. Then, as the clock struck midnight, the ground trembled, and a monstrous shape emerged from the shadows at the edge of the village. It was massive, covered in matted fur, its body twisted and contorted as it moved with unnatural speed. Its eyes glowed with an eerie red light, and its mouth dripped with venomous saliva, its fangs gleaming in the moonlight. It was the creature of legend, an ancient terror returned from the depths of the earth. Ethan and Claire had no choice but to run. They sprinted through the village, heart pounding, as the creature's growls echoed in the distance. It was closing in on them, its presence overwhelming. But then, as they rounded a corner, the villagers stepped forward. The sacrifice had been made. A man, trembling in fear, stood at the center of the square, ready to meet his fate. The creature stopped in its tracks, its hungry eyes locked onto the man. With a bone-chilling roar, it lunged forward, its claws slicing through the air, and the sacrifice was claimed. Ethan and Claire, now witnessing the horrors of the crimson snow firsthand, realized that they were lucky to have escaped. But they knew that the nightmare would continue, that the creature would return in another decade to claim its due, and that no one would ever be safe from the curse of the crimson snow. As they fled into the night, the snow began to fall again, redder than ever.